Yeah. What's the longest run you've ever done? What's the longest run you've ever done?
I did 125 miles or 200 kilometers, the furthest I've gone.
Jeez.
Um, so it's mostly 100-mile type stuff that I've done so far, and then things less or shorter than that too, like 100Ks, 80Ks, 50Ks are kind of the go-tos for me. The 24 hours one, I really want to kind of give a good crack at. I've done some 24 hours in the past, like with very little to no success.
Yeah.
But part of that, I think, is just I've always tried to kind of piggyback those into like a eco race that I was doing that was, more or less a focus on a 100 miler. And then I thought like, okay, maybe I got one more race left in me. I'll try this 24 hour. And I think just what I've learned from doing that is that that event itself kind of is going to take its own specific build up and its own real kind of, it needs its own attention versus kind of being a second opportunity or build this off of a previous training strategy or training plan type of a thing. So when I can finally get that done, I think I'll hit pretty high mileage relative to what I've done so far. But that's kind of an interesting event.
Yeah. I think the thing that I was just looking up here was that run, the stats that you put up after the run. That was the one thing that stood out for me was your average heart rate. Your average heart rate stayed at 144 throughout that entire run, and you were going at
Hmm.
718 mile. Like that is how have you is that just an accumulation of all the training that you've done over the years? And I also think because that's like someone else's zone two. Now, if a lot of people don't know about zone two training, you're about 70% of your max heart rate, and that's my zone two. But the speed at which you're going, you're flat out for a lot of people there. Um, how is that? That's just accumulated over years and years of training, or is it something that you've really worked on trying to get your heart rate to stay as low as it can?
Yeah, for 100-mile races, usually I can get my average heart rate up a little higher than that. Like usually around 150 is kind of where it'll end up playing out. In some things, these events sometimes take place like in hot weather climates and things like that, which skews the data a little. But yeah, I think like for me, when I get to the point where I'm really hyper focused on practicing race day intensity, it ends up being kind of just under or close to my aerobic threshold or kind of like that top end of zone two. And so I just spend a ton of time developing that system, both like in my peaking phase as well as kind of in my base building phase. So I've probably spent more time running that kind of relative intensity than any other in my training. So it's probably where I'm the most efficient, I would guess, just from the exposure to it that I've had. And it's also the one I can probably move the needle on the most in terms of dropping my overall pace at that intensity. So usually when I'm kind of getting really fit within that system, I can get down to like close to 6 or just under 6 minute mile pace at about 155 beats per minute, which is right at my aerobic threshold. And when I know I'm down there, then it's just a question of like how long can I sustain that, and then that's what I'm kind of working on during like my peaking phase of training, where I'm just trying to build volume at that intensity so that I can kind of have the tools I need on race day if it's a 100 miler.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually recently started doing more long distance. Well, more long distance compared to what my sport offered, because we were more about speed endurance and speed events and
Sure.
and a bit more power based. And I think there's this misconception when people get stuck into like running and getting into their air running is that they have to every session has to be like balls to the wall and nailing it and just flying out there. And you see
Mhm.
heart rates hitting way above like 160s to 170s, and I was actually in that category. I was like, I think it's the misconception you get from the societies like go harder. Just if you're not working, if you're not literally like dying on the floor after your run, you're done. That's
Mhm.
not a good session. And the thing that's been so interesting is that pulling back and going so slow and keeping your heart rate lower, and then that's built. I've just suddenly seen the difference now that it's changed. But I mean, your pace is that zone two for you is insanely high.
Yeah, I find that if you can really develop that kind of system, then that's kind of like the perfect spot where you can go almost anywhere from.
Mm.
So like when I get really fit within that and I get get my pace down to around 6 or just under 6 at that intensity, then I know I'm probably only maybe 6 or 8 weeks away from peaking from whatever I want to peak for the most part. Like if I decide I wanted to do a 5K, I would just start doing workouts that are going to simulate kind of that intensity. Or if I want to do a 100 miler, I can. Well, the 100 miles is maybe a bad example because I'm probably just going to continue on at that intensity then. But it kind of sets you up. It kind of gives you that foundation, and I think you're spot on. A lot of times people they'll get that kind of like go big or go home mentality and feel like they have to be sprinting, and they're uh they're just taking volume off the table by doing that, or avoiding building kind of the foundation on which they're going to be able to put some of those type of workouts on down the road and get that benefit from them as well. So I find it really interesting always when you see folks that are doing kind of like a more explosive sport and they talk about kind of their zone 2 development or their base development and kind of where they're structuring that stuff, because I think like, even those folks can really lean on a strong foundation in that in order to make improvements kind of even at the more specific things to their sport or the intensity of the sport they're doing.
Yeah, it's probably not seen as like the sexy training. That's probably why.
Right. Yeah.
It's just
Grinding out miles after miles or
yeah,
kilometers after kilometers.
yeah.
When you started doing that, did you start seeing your pace drop at that intensity though? Or
Yeah, yeah. I have like it's probably started to change now. It's really
Mhm.
started to shift now. I think yeah, like I said, most of our stuff was like speed interval training, and I ran my first marathon like last year, and that was a shock to the system.
Mhm.
But I mean, I'd even heard you say that marathon is just a different animal in the sense that you're constantly pushing it, and if one small error could cost you. And on my training leading into that marathon, I was given the spot for a charity and just out of nowhere, but it was if I had my time again, I would definitely go down this route that I'm doing now, and I 100% know I would be way better off, because all of my training when I was doing my marathon was really pushing the high end all the time, and I didn't really know what I
Mhm.
was doing. Just didn't know what I was doing at the time, because that's not why my training systems have been. I'd never been in that world before, and yeah, the benefit I'm seeing now, just in general day-to-day running, and that base fitness is raising because of this zone 2 training.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the marathon is a really interesting one too, because like a lot of times the intensity that you can sustain is going to be kind of in this gray area kind of territory where it's kind of between your aerobic threshold and your lactic threshold. So you're not really like in this point where you're developing one of those two kind of major ones. So you at a certain point you have to kind of start putting in work that's at goal race intensity. So you find yourself in a little bit of a goofy spot, but it's an interesting event to follow for sure.